A billionaire disguised himself as a homeless man and sat quietly on a cold city sidewalk waiting to see how people would treat someone who had nothing. Most people walked past him. Some avoided looking at him entirely. But then something unexpected happened. A young girl with almost nothing herself stopped and did something so unbelievably kind that it completely changed the billionaire's understanding of humanity forever. What happened next shocked everyone, including the billionaire himself. Because sometimes the people with the least are the ones who give the most. And this one moment of kindness would soon create a chain reaction that would transform several lives in ways no one could have imagined. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of a luxurious penthouse high above the city. From that height, the streets below looked small, almost unreal. Standing quietly near the window was Jonathan Hayes, one of the richest men in the country. At 48 years old, Jonathan had everything people usually spent their entire lives chasing: private jets, luxury penthouses in New York, London, and Dubai, a tech empire worth billions. His name regularly appeared on business magazines and financial news headlines. To the outside world, Jonathan Hayes was the definition of success. But that night he felt strangely empty. He stood silently with his hands behind his back, watching the rain fall across the glowing city skyline. Down below, thousands of people rushed through their evening routines. Cars moved like rivers of light. Restaurants buzzed with laughter. And somewhere on those same streets were people struggling just to survive. Jonathan's mind drifted back to a much different life. Long before the wealth, before the fame, before anyone knew his name. He had once been the son of a small-town mechanic. His father, Thomas Hayes, owned a tiny repair shop that barely made enough money to support the family. Their house had creaky floors and a roof that leaked every winter. Jonathan remembered many nights when dinner was simple bread and soup. But his father had always carried himself with quiet pride. Thomas Hayes believed deeply in one simple idea. One sentence he repeated to Jonathan countless times growing up. "A man's true wealth," his father would say while wiping grease from his hands, "is how he treats people who can do nothing for him." Those words stayed with Jonathan long after his father passed away. They were the reason Jonathan donated millions to charities every year. The reason he funded scholarships and hospitals. But lately, a troubling thought had begun creeping into his mind. Jonathan wondered something he had never questioned before. Were people truly kind? Or were they simply kind to power? At business meetings, everyone respected him. At charity events, people praised him. At restaurants, staff treated him like royalty. But what if none of that was real? What if people only behaved that way because they knew who he was? That question grew stronger one evening during a large charity gala hosted by his company. Hundreds of wealthy guests filled the ballroom. Elegant music played softly. Champagne glasses clinked. Speeches were made about generosity and compassion. Jonathan stood near the stage listening as one guest passionately spoke about helping the less fortunate. Then, suddenly, a young waiter accidentally dropped a tray of drinks. Glass shattered across the floor. The room went quiet. The waiter froze in embarrassment. Instead of helping, several guests simply frowned. One woman sighed loudly in irritation. Another guest stepped aside so the broken glass wouldn't touch his expensive shoes. Only one person bent down to help the waiter clean up. And that person was another server. Jonathan watched the entire moment unfold. And something about it bothered him deeply. The people who talked the most about kindness had done absolutely nothing. Later that night, Jonathan returned to his penthouse unable to stop thinking about it. He poured himself a glass of water and opened his laptop. News headlines appeared across the screen. One article caught his attention. Homeless population rising across the city. Jonathan clicked it. The article showed photos of people sleeping on sidewalks. Families living in shelters. Men and women sitting quietly on street corners holding cardboard signs. Jonathan stared at the images for a long time. Then a strange idea slowly began forming in his mind. If he truly wanted to understand human kindness, there was only one way to do it. He would have to remove the one thing that changed how people treated him: his wealth. The next morning, Jonathan called his most trusted employee, his driver, Marcus. Marcus had worked for Jonathan for almost 20 years. He had seen Jonathan build his company from a small startup into a billion-dollar empire. So when Jonathan asked him to meet privately in the garage that morning, Marcus knew something serious was happening. "Marcus," Jonathan said calmly, "I want to try an experiment." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of experiment?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment. Then he explained his idea. He would disguise himself as a homeless man, spend an entire day on the streets, and observe how people treated someone who appeared to have nothing. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "You mean actually go out there like that?" Jonathan nodded. "No security. No recognition. Just me as someone the world usually ignores." Marcus crossed his arms. "Sir, that's dangerous." Jonathan smiled slightly. "Maybe. But I think it's necessary." A few hours later, the transformation began. Jonathan's expensive designer suit was replaced with worn-out thrift store clothing, a faded jacket, old jeans, a pair of scuffed shoes. His neatly styled hair was hidden beneath a dusty cap. A makeup artist friend helped roughen his appearance, adding shadows beneath his eyes and subtle marks that made him look tired and weathered. When Jonathan finally looked in the mirror, even he barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the billionaire CEO. In his place stood someone the world might walk past without a second glance. By midday, Jonathan sat quietly on a sidewalk bench near one of the busiest streets downtown. People hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, phones pressed to their ears, eyes focused straight ahead. Some glanced at him quickly, then looked away. Others crossed the street to avoid walking too close. One man wrinkled his nose as he passed. For the first time in decades, Jonathan Hayes felt invisible. Hours went by. He watched the rhythm of the city unfold. Kindness from a few, indifference from many, and quiet struggles hidden behind busy lives. But Jonathan had no idea that before the day ended, one unexpected act of kindness from a complete stranger would soon change the course of several lives, including his own. Before we continue with this incredible journey, I spent countless hours researching and crafting this story to bring you something truly meaningful. If stories like this touch your heart and you want to see more acts of kindness that restore faith in humanity, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It truly means the world to me and helps these important stories reach others who need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens next. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that completely changed your perspective on people? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. The afternoon air had turned colder. Gray clouds hung low above the city, and a steady breeze moved down the streets between the tall buildings. Jonathan Hayes sat quietly on the bench, hunched slightly inside his worn jacket. Cars rushed past, people hurried along the sidewalk, and the rhythm of the city continued without ever slowing down. Every once in a while someone glanced his way, but no one stopped. Jonathan watched people carefully. A businessman walked past talking loudly on his phone. A woman pushing a stroller quickly crossed the street when she noticed him. Two teenagers laughed as they passed, whispering something to each other before looking back and shaking their heads. Jonathan felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being alone in a room, but the kind that comes from being surrounded by people who act as if you don't exist. The hours passed slowly. At one point Jonathan stood and walked a few blocks, observing how the city treated people who appeared poor. Some store owners watched him suspiciously. A security guard outside a luxury hotel politely but firmly asked him to keep moving. Jonathan didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked away. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing the world from a completely different perspective, and it was far harsher than he had imagined. As evening began approaching, Jonathan returned to the bench where he had been sitting earlier. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Office workers started leaving their buildings. The sidewalks became busier. Jonathan leaned back slightly and sighed. Then, suddenly, a small voice spoke. "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" Jonathan looked up. Standing in front of him was a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. She had dark curly hair tied into a loose ponytail and wore a simple school uniform sweater that looked slightly worn at the sleeves. In one hand she held a small backpack. In the other, a paper bag. Jonathan blinked in surprise. Most people hadn't even looked at him. But this girl was standing directly in front of him, looking at him with genuine concern. "Yes, I'm okay," Jonathan said softly. The girl tilted her head slightly. "You don't look okay." Jonathan almost smiled. Children had a way of noticing things adults ignored. "I've had a long day," he admitted. The girl nodded as if she understood. For a moment she looked down at the paper bag in her hand. Then she looked back at him. "My name is Maya," she said. Jonathan hesitated. Then he answered carefully. "Nice to meet you, Maya." She looked at him for another moment before asking quietly, "Did you eat today?" The question caught Jonathan completely off guard. No one had asked him that all day. Not one person. Jonathan paused before answering. "Not yet." Maya immediately opened the paper bag. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in napkins and a small juice box. She carefully pulled them out and held them toward him. "You can have mine," she said simply. Jonathan stared at the food. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. Maya nodded. "My mom says if someone is hungry and you can help, you should." Jonathan felt something tighten in his throat. "But what about you?" he asked. Maya shrugged lightly. "I can eat when I get home." Jonathan looked at the sandwich again. It wasn't fancy. Just bread and peanut butter. But at that moment, it felt more meaningful than the expensive meals he usually ate in luxury restaurants. He accepted it slowly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Maya smiled. "You're welcome." Jonathan opened the sandwich and took a bite. It tasted simple, but somehow comforting. Maya sat down on the bench beside him. "Do you live around here?" she asked. Jonathan thought carefully before answering. "Not exactly. My mom and I live 2 blocks away," Maya said proudly. "She works at the hospital." "That's a very important job," Jonathan replied. Maya nodded seriously. "She says helping people is the most important thing you can do." Jonathan looked at her. "How old are you, Maya?" 11. "And you came all the way here alone?" She pointed behind them. "My school is right there." Jonathan followed her finger. Sure enough, a small school building stood at the end of the street. "I usually walk home," she explained. "But I saw you sitting here earlier when school ended." Jonathan was surprised. "You noticed me then?" Maya nodded. "You looked really tired." Jonathan felt a strange warmth in his chest. All day, hundreds of people had passed by him. But this one child had been paying attention. After a moment, Maya asked another question. "Do you have a family?" Jonathan hesitated again. "Yes," he said finally. "But they're far away." Maya nodded slowly. "My dad passed away when I was little," she said quietly. "My mom says he was very kind." Jonathan listened carefully. "She says the best way to honor him is by helping people when we can." Jonathan looked down at the half-eaten sandwich in his hands. For the first time that day, his eyes felt slightly wet. "You're a very kind person, Maya," he said softly. She smiled shyly. "My mom says kindness spreads," she said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Well," Maya explained, "if you help someone, they might help someone else." Jonathan thought about that. A simple idea, but a powerful one. After a few minutes, Maya stood up. "I should go home before my mom gets worried." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you for the sandwich." She waved slightly as she stepped away. "Maybe I'll see you again tomorrow." Jonathan watched her walk down the sidewalk until she disappeared around the corner. He sat there silently for a long time afterward. The sandwich was gone, but something much bigger remained. All day he had seen indifference, avoidance, judgment, but the only person who had truly cared was a little girl with almost nothing. Jonathan looked up at the city lights, and for the first time since starting his experiment, he felt hope. But what Jonathan didn't know yet was that this small moment of kindness would soon lead to a discovery that would change not only Maya's life, but his own as well. The next morning, Jonathan Hayes woke up earlier than usual. For years, his mornings had followed the same routine: emails from executives, meetings with investors, financial reports, and conference calls across different time zones. But today felt different. Instead of putting on one of his tailored suits, he once again reached for the worn jacket and faded cap from the day before. Standing in front of the mirror, he adjusted the disguise. The same tired face stared back. The homeless man. Jonathan paused for a moment. He wasn't returning to the street because of curiosity anymore. He was returning because of Maya, the little girl who had given away her lunch without hesitation. Within an hour, Jonathan was back sitting on the same bench downtown. Morning traffic buzzed through the streets. People hurried toward offices and cafes, holding steaming cups of coffee while scrolling through their phones. Most of them passed by Jonathan just as they had the day before, without noticing him, without caring. But Jonathan barely paid attention to them. His eyes kept drifting toward the school building at the end of the street. Around 3 in the afternoon, the school bell rang. Children poured out through the front doors, laughing, talking, running toward waiting parents. Jonathan watched carefully. Then he saw her. Maya stepped out of the school building with her backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. She walked slowly down the sidewalk. When her eyes reached the bench, she stopped. Her face lit up with surprise. "You came back," she said happily as she hurried toward him. Jonathan smiled. "I said I might." Maya sat down beside him again. "I thought maybe you left," she admitted. "Not yet," Jonathan replied. For a moment they simply sat there watching the busy street. Then Maya opened her backpack. "I brought something," she said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. From the backpack she pulled out another small paper bag. Inside were 2 apples and a small container of crackers. "You shouldn't keep giving me your food," Jonathan said gently. Maya shrugged. "My mom packed extra today." Jonathan wasn't completely sure that was true, but he accepted one of the apples. "Thank you." They talked for nearly 20 minutes. About school. About the city. About Maya's favorite subjects. "I like drawing," she said. Jonathan looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded and reached into her backpack again. This time she pulled out a small sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings. City streets. People sitting on benches. Buildings. Even animals. Jonathan flipped through the pages slowly. The drawings were detailed, carefully shaded. Far better than most children her age. "Maya, these are amazing," he said honestly. She looked slightly embarrassed. "My teacher says I'm good," she admitted quietly. Jonathan studied one particular drawing. It showed a busy street corner, cars passing by, people walking quickly, and on the bench, a man sitting alone. Jonathan looked up. "You drew this yesterday?" Maya nodded. "I like drawing things I see." Jonathan realized something important in that moment. This girl wasn't just kind. She was observant, creative, talented, and yet, she lived a life where her biggest concern seemed to be whether a stranger had eaten lunch. "Maya," Jonathan said carefully, "have you ever thought about becoming an artist?" She smiled slightly. "Maybe." Then her smile faded. "But art school costs a lot of money." Jonathan said nothing, but something inside him was beginning to change. Their conversations continued over the next few days. Every afternoon Maya stopped by the bench. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she showed Jonathan new drawings. Sometimes they simply talked. Jonathan learned more about her life. Her mother, Elena, worked long shifts at a hospital as a cleaning assistant. They lived in a small apartment. Money was tight. But Maya never complained. In fact, she seemed more focused on helping others than worrying about herself. One afternoon, Jonathan asked gently, "Does your mom know you stop here after school?" Maya nodded. "She told me not to talk to strangers, but I told her you're nice." Jonathan chuckled softly. "I'm glad she trusts your judgment." But as the days passed, Jonathan also began noticing something else. Maya often seemed tired. Sometimes she coughed quietly, and occasionally she rubbed her stomach as if she were hungry. Something about it bothered him. Then one evening, Jonathan finally discovered the truth. That afternoon, Maya arrived later than usual. Her steps were slower. Her shoulders looked heavy. "You're late today," Jonathan said gently. Maya sat down quietly. "My mom had to work extra hours," she explained. Jonathan noticed the dark circles under her eyes. "Did you eat today?" he asked. She hesitated. "Not really." Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Maya looked down at the ground. "My mom's paycheck got delayed this week." Jonathan listened carefully. "So we're trying to make the groceries last longer." Jonathan was silent for a moment. Then Maya quickly added, "But it's okay. Mom says things will get better soon." Jonathan looked at her small hands gripping the edge of the bench. This 11-year-old girl had been giving away food she barely had herself. And suddenly, Jonathan felt something stronger than curiosity. He felt responsibility. But there was a problem. Jonathan couldn't simply hand Maya money. That would immediately expose who he really was. And if he revealed himself too soon, he might destroy the honest connection they had built. For the first time since starting the experiment, Jonathan felt uncertain. Later that evening he met Marcus again. "She's struggling," Jonathan said quietly. Marcus nodded. "So help her." "It's not that simple," Jonathan replied. "If I suddenly show up as a billionaire offering money, it changes everything." Marcus crossed his arms. "So what are you going to do?" Jonathan stared out the window for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "I'm going to help her." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "How?" Jonathan turned back toward him. "Without her knowing." But even Jonathan didn't yet realize how complicated that decision would become. Because helping Maya would soon reveal challenges far greater than money, and force him to make a choice that could change both of their lives forever. The next few days, Jonathan Hayes couldn't stop thinking about Maya. Her tired eyes, her quiet strength, and the way she had shared food she barely had herself. The world had treated her unfairly, yet she still chose kindness. Jonathan had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and solved complicated business problems. But this situation felt different, because helping Maya required more than money. It required care, and patience, and trust. The next afternoon, Jonathan returned to the bench as usual. When Maya arrived, she looked even more exhausted than before. "Long day?" Jonathan asked gently. She nodded. "My mom had to take another shift." Jonathan studied her carefully. "You shouldn't have to worry about things like groceries," he said quietly. Maya shrugged. "My mom says hard times don't last forever." Jonathan smiled slightly. "She sounds like a strong woman." "She is," Maya replied proudly. Jonathan paused for a moment before speaking again. "Maya, what if someone wanted to help you and your mom?" Maya looked confused. Why would someone do that? Jonathan thought of her words from earlier. "Kindness spreads." "Because sometimes people help each other," he said. Maya thought about that. "My mom says accepting help can be hard," she replied softly. "But helping someone else later is the best way to repay it." Jonathan nodded slowly. That night, he made a decision. He would help Maya's family. But he would do it carefully, quietly, without destroying the sincerity of their friendship. The next morning, Jonathan called Marcus. "I need you to find out something for me," Jonathan said. Within a few hours, Marcus returned with information. Maya's mother Elena worked cleaning hospital rooms overnight. She worked almost 60 hours a week, but the hospital had recently reduced staff hours, which meant Elena's income had dropped. Bills were piling up, groceries were scarce, and the small apartment they lived in was barely affordable anymore. Jonathan listened silently. Then he gave Marcus a list of instructions. First, groceries would be delivered to Elena's apartment anonymously. Second, a scholarship fund would quietly be arranged through Maya's school for talented art students. And third, Jonathan wanted to personally meet Maya's mother, but not as the billionaire she had never heard of, as the homeless man her daughter trusted. Marcus shook his head slightly. "You're really doing this?" Jonathan smiled. Sometimes the smallest kindness deserves the biggest response. A few days later, something unexpected happened. When Maya arrived at the bench that afternoon, she looked shocked. "You won't believe what happened," she said excitedly. Jonathan leaned forward. "What?" "Someone delivered groceries to our apartment." Jonathan raised his eyebrows, pretending to be surprised. "Really?" "Boxes and boxes of food," Maya said. "My mom kept asking who sent them, but there was no name." Jonathan smiled softly. "Maybe someone saw how hard your mom works." Maya looked thoughtful. Then she said something that caught Jonathan off guard. "My mom says sometimes angels help people." Jonathan chuckled quietly. Well, maybe she's right. But the real surprise came the following week. One afternoon, Maya didn't arrive at the bench. Jonathan waited. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, Marcus received a message. "Maya is at the hospital," he said carefully. Jonathan stood immediately. "What happened?" Marcus looked at the message again. Her mom collapsed during work. Within minutes, Jonathan was in the car heading toward the hospital. When they arrived, he remained in disguise. Inside the waiting area, Maya sat alone in a chair. Her eyes were red from crying. Jonathan walked slowly toward her. "Maya." She looked up. When she saw him, she rushed forward and hugged him tightly. "They won't tell me what's happening," she said through tears. Jonathan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay." A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room. He spoke softly to Maya. "Your mother collapsed from exhaustion," the doctor explained. "She's stable now, but she needs rest." Jonathan felt relief flood through him. But he also realized something important. Elena had been working herself to the point of collapse just to survive. That night, Jonathan made a decision he could no longer delay. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the hospital again. But this time, he wasn't wearing the disguise. Instead, he wore a clean suit. Marcus stood beside him. When Maya entered the hospital room with a nurse, she froze. The man standing beside her mother looked strangely familiar, but she couldn't understand why. Then Jonathan spoke. "Maya, it's me." Her eyes widened. The bench, the sandwich, all those conversations. Slowly, realization spread across her face. "You're not homeless." Jonathan shook his head gently. "My name is Jonathan Hayes." Elena sat up slightly in the hospital bed. "The Jonathan Hayes?" she asked. Jonathan nodded. Maya stared at him in disbelief. "But why?" Jonathan looked at both of them. "I wanted to see how people treat someone who has nothing." He paused before continuing. "And your daughter showed me more kindness than anyone else." Maya's eyes filled with tears. "You changed my life that day," Jonathan said. Then he turned to Elena. "Your daughter has incredible talent and an even bigger heart." He reached into his briefcase. "I've arranged a full scholarship for Maya to attend one of the best art schools in the city." Maya gasped. "And," Jonathan continued gently, "I'd like to help your family with housing and medical support so you never have to work yourself to exhaustion again." Elena covered her mouth in shock. "You would do that for us?" Jonathan smiled warmly. "No." He looked at Maya. "I'm doing it because kindness deserves to grow." Maya ran forward and hugged him tightly. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes felt something more valuable than success. He felt purpose. 1 year later, a small art gallery downtown held a special exhibition. Paintings covered the walls, each one filled with emotion and life. At the center of the room stood Maya, now 12 years old. Her artwork had been selected for a youth artist showcase. One painting stood out the most. It showed a rainy city street, a tired man sitting on a bench, and a young girl offering him a sandwich. Below the painting was a small title, "Kindness Changes Everything." Jonathan stood quietly beside her, smiling proudly. Visitors admired the painting. Some even wiped away tears. But the moment that touched Jonathan the most came near the end of the evening. Outside the gallery, a man sat quietly on the sidewalk. He looked tired and hungry. Without hesitation, Maya walked over and handed him a small bag of food. Jonathan watched silently. And in that moment, he realized something powerful. Kindness doesn't just change one life. It spreads. And sometimes, the smallest gesture can transform the world. Months passed after that life-changing day in the hospital. But the impact of that simple sandwich on a rainy afternoon continued spreading in ways no one expected. Maya's life changed dramatically, but not in the way many people might imagine. Jonathan Hayes made sure her family had a safe, comfortable apartment in a quiet neighborhood close to her school. Elena no longer had to work exhausting double shifts just to keep food on the table. For the first time in years, Maya's mother could rest. She began working normal hours at the hospital again, this time in a better position with stable pay and benefits arranged through a new community program Jonathan funded. But Jonathan was careful about one thing. He didn't want Maya's life to suddenly become about wealth. Instead, he wanted her to keep the values she had always shown: kindness, empathy, and humility. The scholarship he arranged placed Maya in a prestigious art academy for young students with exceptional talent. At first, Maya was nervous. Most of the other students came from wealthy families. Their supplies were expensive. Their parents were successful professionals. But Maya had something different, something more powerful. She had perspective. Her artwork reflected real life: struggle, hope, kindness. Her teachers quickly noticed something special about her. One instructor even told Jonathan privately, "Some students learn technique, but Maya already understands emotion. That's something you can't teach." Within a year, her artwork began appearing in youth exhibitions across the city. Her paintings told stories. Stories about people often overlooked. Stories about compassion. Stories about moments that changed lives. And one painting always appeared in every exhibition: the bench, the sandwich, the rainy street, the moment kindness changed everything. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes also changed. His experiment had started as a question about human nature, but it ended up transforming the way he lived his own life. He launched a new foundation dedicated to supporting struggling families, artists, and community programs across the city. But instead of simply writing checks from behind a desk, Jonathan often visited the programs himself, sometimes quietly, sometimes anonymously, because he had learned something important from Maya. True kindness isn't about recognition. It's about connection. And Elena never forgot the day her daughter walked into the hospital room and discovered the truth. To her, Jonathan wasn't just a billionaire. He was the stranger who had listened to her daughter when others walked by. The man who believed in Maya's talent. The man who turned a moment of kindness into a future filled with opportunity. But the most beautiful part of the story came one evening nearly 2 years later. Jonathan was walking through the city after attending a small art exhibition. As he passed a quiet street corner, he noticed a familiar scene: a young girl standing beside someone sitting on a bench. Jonathan slowed his steps. It was Maya. She was handing a small paper bag to an elderly man sitting alone. Inside the bag were sandwiches and fruit, the same kind of simple meal she once shared. Jonathan stood across the street, watching quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Because in that moment he understood something powerful. Kindness had come full circle. The same compassion that once helped Maya had now become part of who she was. And now, she was passing it on to someone else. Just like her mother had taught her. Just like Jonathan's father once taught him. Because kindness doesn't stop with one person. It travels. It multiplies. It becomes something bigger than a single moment. And sometimes, it all starts with something as simple as sharing a sandwich with a stranger. Stories like this remind us of something the world often forgets. The most powerful changes don't always come from money or fame. They come from small decisions. A decision to stop. A decision to notice someone. A decision to help when no one else does. You never truly know what someone is going through. And you never know how one simple act of kindness might transform their life. Or even your own. Because sometimes the person you help today becomes the person who helps someone else tomorrow. And that is how the world slowly becomes a better place. Stories like this remind us that extraordinary kindness exists all around us. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. It helps more people discover inspiring stories like this one. And if you believe the world needs more reminders of compassion, kindness, and humanity, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Most importantly, look for opportunities in your own life to be someone's unexpected blessing. Maybe it's helping a stranger. Maybe it's encouraging someone who feels invisible. Or maybe it's simply showing kindness when the world expects indifference. So here's my challenge to you. What act of kindness will you perform this week? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might inspire someone else to do the same. Thank you for watching. And remember this. You have the power to change someone's entire world with just one small act of kindness.